Good day everyone, I am Vincent Renee Murata and this is my first ever video here in YouTube, and today we are going to compare my laptop, which is Ryzen 5 4500U, compared to the Core i5-9600. On our first activity, we installed the CPU-Z benchmark to compare our laptop with other brand and models of laptops, and to know our multi-thread score. And today we are tasked to compare our laptop to the other brands that is almost the same multi-thread score with our laptop. So let us compare the Intel Core i5-9600 to the AMD Ryzen 5 4500U. First, let us compare their cost. So the price of the Ryzen 5 4500U is almost $527, and it is way much more expensive than the Core i5 9600 because they have a difference of almost $300 alone. Let us proceed to comparing their specifications. And first is the announcement date. The Intel Core i5 was released on July 7, 2019, while the AMD was released on January 6, 2020. Their type on the Intel Core i5 is on desktop, and AMD Ryzen 5 is for laptop. Their socket type, FCLGA1151 for Intel Core, and FP6 for Ryzen 5. Coffee Lake for the core name for the Core i5, and Renoir for Ryzen 5. Their architecture is both x86 family, and on their generation, on Intel Core i5 it is on 9th generation, while the Ryzen 5 was on 2nd generation. Comparing their turbo frequency, the Intel Core i5 has greater frequency compared to the AMD Ryzen 5, with a difference of 0.6 MHz. On the frequency, the Intel Core i5 also takes the lead with 3.1 MHz compared to the 2.3 MHz of Ryzen 5. They both have 6 cores and threads, and the bus rate of Intel Core i5 is 8 GT per second, while the AMD Ryzen 5 doesn't have any data. And both of them have a lithography of, the Intel Core i5 has 14 nanometers, while the AMD Ryzen 5 has 7 nanometers. The transistor count, the AMD Ryzen 5 takes the lead with 4,600 millions, while the i5 has 3,600 millions. And compared to their power consumption, the Ryzen 5 only consumes 15 watts, while the Core i5 consumes 65 watts. On their memory type, on the Intel Core i5, it has DDR4 2666 for their memory type, while the Ryzen 5 uses DDR4 up to 3200 MHz. Their maximum memory for Intel Core i5 is 128 GB, while AMD Ryzen 5 has a maximum memory of 64 GB. So, why is Intel Core i5-9600 better than AMD Ryzen 5 4500U? So first, it is 34.78% faster CPU speed, because the i5 has 6 times 3.1 GHz compared to the 6 times 2.3 GHz of Ryzen 5. In terms of turbo clock speed, the Intel i5 also takes the lead the Intel i5 is also 1 MB bigger L3 cache compared to Ryzen 5. It also has 20 degrees higher maximum operating temperature and 10.57 higher pass mark result in single thread. And obviously the 64 gig larger maximum memory amount and 23.99 higher multi-core Geekbench 5 result and 11.46% higher single-core Geekbench 5 result. Let us proceed why AMD Ryzen 5 4500U is better than Intel Core i5-9600. 1600 MHz higher RAM speed, 7 nanometer smaller semiconductor size, 1.5 MB bigger L2 cache, 5.34% higher pass mark result, 50 watts lower TDP, 0.25 MB per core more L2 cache per core, 28.56 Gbps more memory bandwidth, and lastly 350 MHz faster GPU turbo speed. For software benchmarks, for example, you plan to use the processor not only for gaming but also for programming, video editing, or video rendering, streaming, machine learning, and then first of all, you need to pay attention to the performance in multi-thread mode. So, in this mode, you will learn this data, this benchmark below, before you take account of the data of this test. Be sure to check whether the software you're going to use to your computer supports multi-threaded mode. So, comparing their software benchmarks, first is in the Cinebench 15 single core. The Intel has greater points compared to the AMD because it has 186 points compared to 176 of AMD. So Intel also takes the lead in Cinebench 15 multi-core compared to the Ryzen 5. But the Ryzen 5 has higher points in Cinebench 20 single core. But the Intel Core i5-9600 takes the lead again in Cinebench 20 multi-core and 1151 points for AMD Ryzen 5 compared to the 942 of Core i5, and lastly on the Cinebench 23 multi-core, the Core i5 takes the lead with 6463 compared to the 5620 of the AMD Ryzen 5. So on their pass mark, the Intel Core i5-9600 has bigger points in the single core compared to the AMD that has only have 2452 compared to the 2747 of the Core i5. On the other hand, on the multi-core, the AMD Ryzen 5 has the advantage against the Core i5 with 11,314 compared to the 10,620 of the Intel Core i5. And using the Geekbench 5.2, so this benchmark shows multi-threaded and single-threaded processors performance on the Intel Core, and the Intel Core i5-9600 takes the bigger portion compared to the Ryzen 5 in both single-core and multi-core. Processors benchmark. So the Core i5-9600 has 55% and Ryzen 5 4500U has 56%. This shows that the performance of the processors in single-threaded and multi-threaded mode. In this comparison, Ryzen 5 4500U is 1% better than the Core i5-9600. The data source is several popular tests. Detailed information can be found below. So, in terms of the gaming performance, the Core i5-9600 has 55% score compared to the 54% of the Ryzen 5 4500U. So, On the next slide, I am going to show you the gaming performance of the both microprocessors. So, the gaming benchmark for Fortnite, Valorant, Cyberpunk 2077, Apex Legends, Call of Duty Warzone, Overwatch, Red Dead Redemption 2, Doom Eternal, Warzone, Assassin's Creed, and Valheim. The uh, Core i5 takes the bigger score compared to the Ryzen 5 in terms of gaming. And in terms of power consumption, to make a finishing choice of which processor is better, you should also consider the generation of its core. The newer the processor generation, the better its performance in games and benchmarks, as well as its energy efficiency. In this case, Ryzen 5 4500U is more energy efficient than the Core i5-9600 because the Core i5 consumes 65 watts while 15 watts only for the Ryzen 5. So the Ryzen 5 is more uh, energy friendly, so it saves more energy compared to the Core i5. So in terms of business, here is the graph of their market share of both Core i5 and Ryzen 5. So the yellow one shows the graph of the Core i5 from January 20 to February 2022. So as you can see, the Ryzen 5 4500U takes more share, more market share compared to the Core i5 9600 because I think maybe AMD Ryzen 5 4500U is much more used with software benchmarks, and it is not usually used for gaming, so it is in demand with the students, especially during this pandemic. And this ends my presentation. Thanks for watching.